He is an Israeli violist and music researcher with extensive international experience in early music. An alumnus of the Jerusalem Academy of Music and the Juilliard School, he recently received a DMA from the University of Miami Frost School of Music, where he conducted research on Soviet viola. The title of his paper today is Pamyati Shostakovicha, Soviet Work for Viola in Memory of Shostakovich. And in light of his Deathbed Sonata, please join me in welcoming him.
Thank you all for being here today. И хочу тоже приветствовать наши русские коллеги. Я считаю, что это тривиально, что вообще есть такая возможность. Спасибо всем, кто организовал эту конференцию. В наши времена это абсолютно необходимо быть в такой конференции. Это я просто... Thank you, Dr. Reesor, for chairing this session on the 50th anniversary of Shostakovich's passing. While my topic is quite morbid, I'm hoping that it will serve as a useful connection between Josh's wonderful presentation and Tanya's, which I'm sure will be superior as well. So before a wonderful quote on the Sonata by Mikhail Pugil, take a second, read and observe these beautiful words. In July of 1975, precisely 50 years ago, Shostakovich completed his last composition, the Sonata Opus 147 for viola and piano. The sonata, about 35 minutes of self-reflection in a somewhat minimalistic texture, mainly due to the composer's motoric struggles in his last days, carries a profound, painful, yet pacified farewell from his life and from his art. In following years, many Soviet composers dedicated works in memory of Shostakovich, such as the Prelude for solo violin by Schnittke or Symphony No. 12 by Weinberg. Among these, in memoriams, one can find several compositions for viola and piano, which are particularly interesting to examine for their profound dialogue with Opus 147, and since the viola has such a strong connection to morbidity, particularly in the music of Shostakovich. The timbre of the viola, as described by many Soviet, Russian, and Western scholars, is associated with the human voice. Frequencies resonate with internal, more melancholic emotions. Although not stated anywhere, this might be the very reason that Shostakovich turned to the viola when his end was near. You can see a brief at the beginnings of each movement here. The shape of the sonata is unique, from its general landscape of moderate, slow, fast, and slow movements to the treatment and manipulation of motifs with a structural context. First movement, for example, might present traceable fundaments of sonata form, sonatne allegro. Yet, its actual form is determined by a series of choral-like ritornelli in the piano, occurring every 90 bars, creating a symmetrical arch frame that supports the musical plot. The second, livelier movement, which some see as an extended scherzo, uses large blocks of quotations from Shostakovich's own 1944 unfinished opera Igraki, The Gamblers, featuring for the last time his famous demonic sarcasm. And Josh, by the way, Igraki is another great example of an opera that is entirely based on a motive of laughter. The orchestra laughs all the time, and sometimes the characters, the male characters as well. The long, untypical finale movement almost feels like so composed and presents more Shostakovichian topics, such as a funeral march or broken triads, sometimes considered as a reference to Beethoven, leading to a process of tonal distillation into the eternal C major. Structurally, looking at the second and third movements as attached, as the ending of the second movement suggests, their combined form becomes identical to that of the first movement, this time using a series of similar viola cadences to divide the musical flow. This is a diagram of the first movement versus the second and third combined, showing the same. Interestingly, according to several scholars, Shostakovich was inspired by a few earlier sonatas for viola and piano, mainly those of Weinberg from 1945 and Grigori Fried from 1971, that were unique in their structure and their content compared to the common models of sonatas in the USSR. Fried's sonata shows a reduced yet similar slow, fast, slow structure like Opus 147, evoking false expectations for traditional form. When it uses the texture of a perpetual, sometimes repeated slow quarters, creating a feeling of a never-ending stressful march. Second movement is fast and aggressive, and the third functions as a postlude, concluding the piece sadly and solemnly. I would still consider Opus 147 as revolutionary. However, for the new extents that Shostakovich reaches, such as the size of this unconventional form, the relatively small amount of musical drama or virtuosity, and for its impact. My corpus research of original Soviet viola repertoire reveals indeed a tendency in the genre of sonatas before 1975, either solo or with piano, to prefer traditional structural concepts. Sonatas would usually end with a fast, impressive finale, or at least include enough presentable materials in previous movements. It is important to remember that sonatas were practical compositions, meant to be performed in a conventional concert hall setting. They often functioned as a central piece, the main course of an instrumental recital, and hence were expected to show off the instrumentalism, virtuosity, and musicianship of the performers. Many instrumental genre in the USSR had gradually incorporated more tragic, slow, or meditative content. Sonatas and concerti, pre the 1970s, were still mainly in favor of spotlighting the soloistic frame. You can see here in the table, the red ones are the exceptions, all the rest are sonatas in this particular model. I wish to demonstrate how Opus 147 was a game changer in the approach to soloistic repertoire and how the in memoriam viola works served as vessels to spread this new instrumental approach. Our first example is the 1976 Sonata for Viola and Piano by Zlata Tkach, dedicated in memory of Shostakovich, which, for the best of my knowledge, was never commercially recorded and published only once in the USSR. It was written for a performance in December of 1976, as part of Shostakovich, in which both Opus 147 and Tkach were played by violist Mikhail Müller and pianist Lyudmila Vaverko. In 1978, she made a version of the piece for viola and string orchestra, and later the piece was awarded the first prize in a domestic Moldovan chamber music competition. See the afisha for the title. As Galina Kachanova states, the sonata, being inspired by its dedicatee, is contemplative, yet dramatic and grotesque at times, with a deep cyclical philosophical approach. Kachanova also pointed out that this is Tkach's first Krupная sonata, large form sonata, and hence a departure point from which she kept developing her take on the genre. The opening of the first movement with pizzicato in the viola, soft dynamics, moderate slow pacing, and a rather thin overall texture instantly creates a parallel between Tkach and Opus 147. Shostakovich on one side and Tkach on the other. The first two chords in the piano, combining major sevenths or diminished octaves with minor thirds or augmented seconds, serve as the main harmonic foundation for the piece. The linear version of this mixture, which dominates the rest of the piece, calls for a topical association with the famous bedroom depression aria of Katerina Lvovna from Lady Macbeth, or Izmailova. Let's listen to the opening of the first movement. This is a sketch of my own recording of the piece, which I hope to record in the next year, which is also the 20th anniversary or 20th anniversary of her passing and 50th anniversary of her sonata. And I play with pianist and researcher Dr. Natalie Rothenberg. Let's hope this will work.
sente niente purtroppo in online. Va bene, posso sopportare, però per gli altri casi può darsi, serve. Non si sente niente online.
Okay, well, hopefully, the Scherzo-like second movement brings a more intensive character, signaling Moldovan folklore thanks to its metric and rhythmic language. Closer reveals another layer of excessive use of the DSCH cryptogram, fueling the chromatic flow of the movement. So we see an excerpt from the second movement, it's a very short one, and let's listen how she combines the two. And so on. The third movement, Postlude 2, noticeably uses a funeral march motif from Opus 147, well as a series of cadences for both in a distillation process towards symmetry. As suggested by Viola, Touch adds an important aspect to the slow-fast slow model by using the entire first movement as an exposition of materials, the second movement as a development of those materials, and the third movement as a concluding statement. Although with Touch's fascinating attention to symmetry between even more formalistic than Shostakovich, the sonata turns into a wholesome, profound. Really here, the SCH. Besides referring to Opus 147, Tkach uses Shostakovich's language even more extensively throughout the piece. Many of you know, scholars like Mazel, Dolzhansky, or Brigham defined in their writings the different topics and devices forming Shostakovich's famous musical language. Both Mazel and Dolzhansky, for example, agree that the Phrygian mode is Shostakovich's true minor mode. Such first two degrees of the mode, half step apart, are one of the most prominent melodic components in his literature, defining his use of step motion. The two minor triads placed on top of the first two Phrygian degrees, as demonstrated in Katerina's aria, are crucial for understanding Shostakovich's harmonical and tonal thinking. It shows how the very last melodic statement in Opus 147 here is the same Phrygian 010. And it seems like Tkach took much advantage of this feature along with its longer version, 0123, 0134, which is the SCH cryptogram, 0145, which is the Carmen or the Fate motive, and 210, which is the implementation. Additionally, both Pecharova and the viola scholar Igor Stott suggest that Tkach also uses a morbid dies irae like melodic line, which, in my opinion, might refer to Shostakovich's iconic 14th. As Kachalova states, the music in both sonatas, Rождается из тишины, born from silence, and as I believe, returns to silence as well. Whether Tkach was familiar with Opus 147 or consciously aware of her use of Shostakovich's language, her sonata offers an important statement on Shostakovich and his legacy and continues his self-reflective spirit. According to violist Andrei Tuchakis, who researched and recorded the music of Alexander Lefkovich, the young composer stepped against the Soviet tendency to compose in the style of Shostakovich, but later came into realization that Shostakovich is indeed as canonic as other classical composers like Beethoven. He then composed the Viola Sonata in his memory, and in 2009 he even arranged Opus 147 for viola and strings, dedicated to and performed by his classmate Yuri Gushkin. The 1984 Sonata in memory of Shostakovich for viola and piano was first performed in 1985 in Kiev by violist Dmitro Gavrilets and pianist Stalina Kiva. Similarly to Tkach, served as a compositional departure point for the young composer. Likewise, it consists of 3 movements in a slow-fast-slow layout. The first movement is also introductive with a similar dynamic path as in Opus 147. The second movement is livelier and uses somewhat similar rhythms and articulation like touch in a more jazzy manner. Movements. The third movement is once again a postlude, although in this case, the viola alone stays alone in the end, leaving a more open ending, not as complete and peaceful as in the other. Throughout the sonata, the use of DSCH and Shostakovichian step motion is quite noticeable, described by Tuchakis as crying intonation. In comparison to Tkach, Lefkovich spends more time with fifth and fourth, which are characteristic of Opus 147, and as Kugel suggests, symbolize the tuning of a string instrument, deeper metaphor of a self-balancing. The name of Belgian ex-Soviet Ukrainian violist Mikhail Kugel and already dropped twice in this presentation for his exemplary interpretation of Shostakovich's music, and since he published many useful writings on Shostakovich and Opus 147. His In Memoriam Shostakovich suite for viola and piano was composed in the late 1980s and was published only in 1999 in Belgium. Unlike the sonata, the suite has 6 movements in contrasting tempi. Is based on the DSCH, and later still uses the Phrygian 010, fifth and fourth, funeral march topics and gestures associated with lamentation. Additionally, the Waltz Scherzo uses some other elements typical to Shostakovich, not addressed by Tkach. The Pascalia recalls the important take of Shostakovich on this job. Ending on a moral note, Kugel's piece brings different voice in the Shostakovich commemoration, not as centered, aiming to keep his spirit more vivid. The works of Tkach, Lefkovich, or Kugel are not just a homage or a loving tribute to Shostakovich. By using his own language and manipulations within the context of the Viola Sonata, they had constituted a new step in the approach to the instrument. You can see many of the post-1975 Soviet viola sonatas use an overall shape influenced by Opus 147. Their pacing is slower, not as dramatic, more sophisticated in structure, and more philosophical and contemplative in character. They often deal with pain, trauma, and death, and as such become what I call a grand élégie. When analyzing works from the 1980s, such as the 1987 Sonata Dialog for viola and piano by Vladimir Ryabov, or the 1989 Sonata for viola and piano by Mikhail Sorokin, one can acknowledge the impact of Opus 147 on the viola literature. Although both in a single movement, they present similar counterpoint and perpetual marching like Shostakovich. The slow, fast, slow landscape, along with the other smaller contours from Opus 147, as well as a pure C major ending with harmonics, can all be traced in Sorokin's sonata. For Ryabov, the repeated quarter structure performs a significant role, and along with the inverted funeral march dotted rhythm creates a distressful sensation of retrograde aging. The last Soviet decade also brought a significant change in the attention of composers to viola concerti. Concerti in general, becoming slower, more melancholic, and less of a show-off piece. The agency of the solo instrument and or the soloist is now of a human, not a superhuman. Schnittke is undoubtedly one of the main contributors to this change, and when analyzing his 1985 viola concerto, it's easy to spot ideas from Opus 147 and the works it impacted. This is according to many scholars of Schnittke. The landscape of the piece, again, slow, fast, slow, and the placement of cadenzas is identical to Shostakovich, as well as the use of step. Affected by Schnittke, the 1990 Concerto for Viola and Chamber Orchestra by Valentin Ibik, already far removed from Opus 147, can still show several important uses of Shostakovich material, such as the Dies Irae motive or the Phrygian 010, as well as the perpetual march texture or similar dynamic joy. Seems like even though Opus 147 was Shostakovich's final piece, it initiated an important new direction in the attention to viola as an instrument and the violist as an agent, sonatas and later in concerti. While not being the only factor in the evolution of Soviet music since 1975, the changes that I attribute to Opus 147 were highly crucial for the literature of the viola and later of other instruments. Shostakovich's formation of instrumental panelegy is becoming more and more relevant as time progresses in the ex-Soviet part of the world and elsewhere. It allows us to process sorrow and grief just with music without words. Thank you for listening.
Thank you so much for that wonderful paper, retreat also, which was lovely. Now, we do have a few minutes for questions. У нас есть время для вопросов, если есть среди вас. Does anyone have any for Dr. Pollak?
I'm just gonna try a silly question. Yes. Thank you, Nathaniel. Beautiful presentation. Lots of everybody. I have a strange question. Did you ever consider this sonata in connection to a minor cello sonata? Because this area is there too, and this strange distribution is a chord movement, but the third movement is kind of tragic and very lyrical, and the second movement is scherzo. I don't know. I just know this. The question, the reason was that the two sometimes perform together.
Yes, yes. Very important remark. I will definitely look deeper into this sonata. It's interesting that, yeah, when people talk about the inspiration for Shostakovich's sonata, they do not mention 19th century music or early 20th century music. They go just to what was written during his life or available to him. We can definitely find examples in the Russian, and not only the Russian, romantic and post-romantic repertoire of sonatas that are not as standard, that are slower in pacing. I wanted to mention the Brigham 120 to clarinet, or the viola sonatas, which were also almost his last piece, not his very last piece, but also a last piece, and also have somewhat slower pacing. We can also think about the Bartok viola concerto as another. We have this joke: you write a viola piece and you die. So sadly, it happened to Shostakovich as well. Yes, it's interesting. If I would have a larger platform, I would definitely explore more earlier repertoire and how it leads to what Shostakovich did. Thank you for this question.
Netanel, thank you for your presentation. It was very fascinating. That you were thinking about recording. Could you tell us a little bit? It's early in the stages of that, but you research so much unknown music. I'm wondering what your research.
I think that the character of Zlata Tkac is fascinating to me. Who she was and how she's poorly remembered now. Are there any people here who are familiar with Zlata Tkac beforehand? This is it's not your fault because she's currently researched a little better in Kishinev. That's what I can tell. And I'm hoping to be in touch with some Moldovan scholars who are currently looking into her music. But I'm hoping actually to use or collaborate with another either instrumentalist or a vocalist because she has some fascinating song cycles in Yiddish. Weinberg also did it, but in the 70s, she always says that this was her Moldovan period. And then from the 1980s, she was fascinated with Yiddish folk and literature and whatnot. And she composed several song cycles and Jewish or Yiddish inspired compositions. So I'm hoping to do something that will feature all sorts of instrumental or vocal works. There's not one more composition that features the viola, but there are no other viola pieces. And I do have to say that Rogna Zlata, rest in peace, that her music is extremely demanding, both for piano and viola. So practicing for me. But I'm really hoping to be able to record it this album and also play some recitals I'm planning for 2026 because she must be remembered. Maybe it was very brief, but there are only, besides those Moldovan people, there's one late poetess, Viola that researched and wrote 2 books on Zlata, and one while she was alive and another one about the past. Books in Russian, and there is a pianist who lives now in Philadelphia. His name is Alexander Timofeyev. He was her student. This is life kind of contribution to documentary music. But that is it. So female composer. What am I doing? Oh, hello. Female composer, Jewish Moldovan. She in my catalog or in my doctoral project, she was awarded the most underrepresented composer. And she definitely deserves more recognition. And I actually, there's quite a few recordings on YouTube. So treat yourself afterwards with Googling or searching her in YouTube. As it sounds, Zlata Tkac or in Russian, doesn't matter. You'll find recordings and you'll really enjoy music.
Thank you so much. Please try me again. Paper.